30 seconds. That was how long it took for a promotion meeting to turn into the biggest mistake our company would make that year. At the time, no one in the room realized it. They were smiling, calm, relieved smiles, the kind people wear when the decision has already been made and the meeting is just a formality. Before we go any further, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel if you found this story touching, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm happy to connect with listeners from all over the world. Okay, now I'll continue. My name is Nicole Morgan. I'm 46 years old, and for the past 5 years, I had managed the most valuable industrial accounts at Silverline Distribution Group, a logistics company responsible for supply chains across the Midwest. Those 5 years were not easy. I negotiated emergency shipments when factories were hours from shutting down. I rebuilt supplier networks after a freight strike nearly collapsed 2 of our largest contracts. I spent more nights on the phone with procurement managers than I care to remember. By last year, the accounts under my management were worth more than $500 million in annual contracts. That was why I was sitting in the conference room that morning. At the head of the table sat Caleb Whitaker, CEO of Silverline. Beside him was Melissa Grant from HR, her laptop open, documents carefully aligned. Across the glass wall behind them, trucks moved slowly across the company's distribution yard. Caleb tapped his pen against the table. "Well, Nicole," he said, glancing down at the report. "The board has spent the past several weeks reviewing candidates for the regional operations director position." Melissa nodded. "Your division posted record numbers this year." "I'm aware," I replied calmly. Caleb inhaled as if preparing to finish the announcement, but before he could say another word, the conference room door opened. No knock. It simply swung inward. High heels clicked against the polished floor, and a woman's voice cut through the room. "Stop!" Then Victoria Whitaker, the CEO's wife, stepped inside. She didn't look at me. She looked at her husband. The board already approved the decision, she said evenly, and then she gestured toward the young man standing behind her. "That position will go to my son. What follows contains fictional elements and is AI-assisted to highlight the humanistic message and emotional experience. Hopefully, you'll find something for yourself. If not, take good care of yourself, and we'll see each other again later." Silence settled across the conference room. No one reacted immediately. It was the kind of silence that only happens when everyone already knows what just happened, but no one wants to acknowledge it out loud. I slowly turned my chair toward the door. Standing behind Victoria Whitaker was a man in his mid-20s, wearing an expensive watch and a confidence that only comes from never having to earn your place in a room. Ethan Whitaker, the CEO's stepson. Victoria stepped farther inside, as if the meeting belonged to her. "The board reviewed the succession plan last week," she said calmly. "The regional operations director position will be assigned to Ethan." Caleb Whitaker shifted slightly in his chair. He didn't argue. He didn't question it. Instead, he adjusted the papers in front of him and cleared his throat. "Well, the company believes it's time for fresh leadership perspectives." Fresh leadership. It was an interesting phrase to use about a division that had just posted the strongest performance in company history. Ethan leaned casually against the table. "I've been reviewing the logistics structure," he said. "There's a lot of opportunity to modernize things." Melissa from HR glanced briefly at me. She understood exactly what had just happened. 5 years. 5 years of building supplier relationships across 3 states. 5 years of emergency shipments, midnight phone calls, and negotiations that saved contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For a moment, I considered saying something, arguing, explaining, but then I looked around the room. No one there was waiting to hear my side. The decision had already been made long before this meeting began, so instead, I simply nodded once. "Congratulations," I said calmly. Ethan smiled as if the outcome had always been obvious. Caleb looked relieved that there would be no confrontation, and as I picked up my notebook and walked toward the door, one thought settled quietly in my mind. Silverline had just made its decision. Now it was time for me to make mine. Monday morning looked exactly like every other Monday at Silverline Distribution Group. Phones rang across the sales floor. Screens flickered with shipment reports. Outside the window, freight trucks rolled steadily through the loading yard as forklifts moved pallets between warehouse lanes. If anyone expected drama after the promotion meeting, they were disappointed. I arrived at 7:30, just like always. I reviewed overnight shipment reports, responded to supplier emails, and corrected a pricing error one of the junior account managers had accidentally sent to a manufacturer in Tulsa. By 9 o'clock, the office had settled into its usual rhythm. No one mentioned the promotion, but in companies like Silverline, news travels faster than freight. By lunchtime, 3 colleagues had stopped by my desk. "You okay?" one of them asked quietly. "I'm fine," I replied, and I meant it. Anger requires surprise. After watching the meeting unfold, there wasn't much left to be surprised about. 2 days later, my office phone rang. "Nicole Morgan." I answered. A familiar voice responded. "Nicole? This is Adrian Cole from Vanguard Freight Systems." I leaned back slightly in my chair. I had worked with Adrian on several regional logistics projects over the years. I heard about the promotion situation. He said, "News traveled fast in this industry, faster than shipments. Adrian didn't waste time. We're expanding our Midwest operations." He continued, "And we're looking for someone who already understands the supplier network." "You thought of me," I said. "We thought of the person managing half the region's industrial accounts." He paused for a moment. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Director of Operations, your division, your strategy." I didn't answer immediately, not because I wasn't interested, but because decisions like that deserved a moment of quiet. Meanwhile, inside Silverline, something had already begun shifting. Ethan Whitaker had started calling several of the major clients I managed, and later that afternoon, one of them called me back. "Nicole," the procurement manager said carefully, "is everything changing over there?" I looked out across the warehouse yard before answering. "Not yet." There was a pause. "Good," he said slowly, "because our renewal contract comes up next quarter, over the next few weeks." Nothing dramatic happened, at least not on the surface. I continued doing my job exactly the same way I always had. Client calls, shipment reviews, supplier negotiations, emergency adjustments when factories needed materials delivered faster than the system predicted. If anyone expected me to react emotionally to the promotion decision, they never saw it, because outwardly, nothing had changed, but internally, something already had. I began organizing everything: client documentation, contract histories, supplier contact notes, delivery contingency plans, the kind of knowledge that never fully lives inside spreadsheets, information built through years of experience. No one questioned it. Preparing documentation always looked like responsible management. A month after the promotion meeting, I walked down the hallway toward the executive offices. In my hand was a plain white envelope. Inside it was the decision Silverline never expected me to make. When I knocked, Caleb Whitaker looked up from his desk. "Nicole," he said, slightly surprised. "Come in." Melissa Grant from HR was already sitting at the conference table beside him, her laptop open. HR had a way of appearing whenever paperwork was involved. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, instead of sitting down. I placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward Caleb. Melissa noticed the handwriting first. Her expression tightened slightly. Caleb opened the envelope. He read the first line, then the second. By the time he reached the bottom of the page, his entire expression had changed. "Nicole," he said slowly, "is this serious?" "Yes." The word settled quietly in the room. Caleb looked back down at the letter. "This is your resignation." "Yes," I said calmly. 30 days. Melissa folded her hands on the table. "From an HR standpoint," she said carefully, "Nicole is following the notice period specified in her employment contract." Caleb leaned back in his chair. For the first time since I had known him, He looked genuinely uncertain. "You're leaving," he said quietly. I didn't answer. He didn't need confirmation, because he already understood the real problem. I wasn't just another manager. The accounts under my responsibility represented over $500 million in active contracts, and suddenly, those relationships had an expiration date. Caleb Whitaker stared at the resignation letter for several seconds. Then he said something that explained more about Silverline's leadership structure than any organizational chart ever could. "We need to bring Victoria into this." Melissa's eyes moved briefly toward me. Caleb had already reached for the phone. "Get Victoria," he said into the receiver. "And Ethan." The room grew quiet after he hung up. Caleb tapped the edge of the resignation letter against the table while he thought. For the first time since the promotion meeting, the confidence he usually carried seemed slightly unsettled. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Just like before. No knock. Victoria Whitaker walked in first. She carried the same composed authority she had displayed during the promotion meeting, calm, confident, completely certain that every room she entered would adjust around her. Ethan Whitaker followed behind her. He leaned casually against the wall, as if this meeting were a minor inconvenience. Victoria didn't sit. She looked directly at Caleb. "You said Nicole submitted a resignation." Caleb slid the letter across the table. She gave 30 days' notice. Victoria read the first few lines quickly before lifting her eyes toward me. "You're leaving." I nodded once. Yes. There was no curiosity in her voice, only evaluation. Then she said something that sounded less like a request and more like an instruction. "You will stay 3 months." The words hung in the air. "They need time to transition your clients." She continued calmly. I met her gaze. "My contract requires 30 days. Victoria didn't blink. 30 days is not enough. Melissa spoke before anyone else could respond. "Nicole's employment agreement clearly specifies a 30-day notice period," she said carefully. "She is fully compliant with the contract." Victoria turned slightly toward her. "The company requires stability." Melissa didn't answer. HR could explain policy, but it couldn't override the CEO's family. Silence settled over the room. Caleb said nothing, which made one thing painfully clear. Everyone in that room knew who was actually running the company. Victoria Whitaker turned back toward me. "You manage over $500 million in accounts," she said evenly. "Yes. And you expect this company to replace that in 30 days, I kept my voice calm. "That depends on how prepared the new director is." For the first time since entering the room, Ethan Whitaker pushed himself off the wall. The faint smile on his face suggested he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. "You're making this bigger than it is," he said. His tone wasn't angry. It was dismissive. The tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who simply hadn't caught up yet. "Companies don't depend on individuals," he continued. "They depend on systems." Melissa's pen stopped moving. She didn't interrupt. But the crease on her forehead said everything. Anyone who had worked in industrial logistics understood one very simple truth. Contracts are signed with companies, but trust is built with people. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "You might want to ask the clients that yourself," I said. Ethan laughed softly. "That won't be necessary." Victoria's patience was clearly fading. She stepped forward. "Those relationships belong to Silverline," she said sharply. I met her gaze without raising my voice. "The contracts belong to the company." Then I added quietly, "But the relationships belong to the people who built them." For the first time since the conversation began, Caleb Whitaker looked genuinely uncomfortable. His fingers tightened against the edge of the table. He finally understood what was sitting in front of him. Not a resignation. A risk. But Victoria had already decided how the meeting would end. "Then you can leave in 30 days," she said coldly. The discussion was over. No negotiation, no compromise, 30 days. Ethan folded his arms, clearly satisfied. Melissa wrote something slowly in her notebook. Caleb said nothing. I stood, pushed my chair back, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, I glanced briefly at Ethan. You should start calling the Morrison account, I said calmly. He frowned. Why? I opened the door. Because in 30 days, I said, they're going to start asking for you. If you agree with my decision to walk away with dignity instead of begging to keep a position I had clearly earned, leave a 1 in the comments. I'm curious how many of you would make the same choice if you were in my place. The next 30 days passed with surprising quiet. No arguments, no dramatic confrontations, just work. I arrived every morning at the same time I always had, reviewed shipment reports, answered supplier emails, walked through the warehouse floor when deliveries arrived late. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath that routine, Silverline was preparing for a transition it didn't fully understand. Most of my time during those weeks was spent documenting things: vendor notes, emergency contacts, shipment contingencies, which suppliers could respond within 4 hours, which ones needed 2 days, which procurement managers preferred a phone call instead of email. Details like that rarely live inside official systems. They live in experience, and experience doesn't transfer neatly. Meanwhile, Ethan had started contacting several of the larger accounts I managed. One afternoon, the procurement manager from Morrison Industrial called me shortly after speaking with him. Nicole, he said carefully, I just spoke with your new director. I waited. I figured you might want to know. There was a short pause. He seemed confident. The manager continued. But I wanted to confirm something. What's that? I asked. Are you still overseeing our account for a few more weeks? Yes, I replied. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Good, he said quietly. Our renewal contract is coming up soon. That wasn't the only call during the final week. Several clients contacted me with similar questions. Are you still handling our shipments for now? Who's taking over after you leave? Every conversation ended the same way. A brief silence. Then the same careful sentence. Let us know where you end up. People in supply chain operations rarely panic quickly, but they pay attention. And once the right people heard that Nicole Morgan was leaving Silverline, something began moving quietly through the market. By my final Friday, the shift had already begun. Not publicly, but quietly enough that only the people involved could feel it. Because in this industry, relationships travel faster than contracts. For the first few weeks after I left Silverline Distribution Group, nothing dramatic happened, at least not publicly. Companies like Silverline don't collapse overnight. They erode quietly. The first visible crack appeared during Morrison Industrial's quarterly contract review. The agreement covered nearly $120 million in annual shipments. When Morrison's procurement team scheduled the meeting, Ethan Whitaker handled the call himself. 2 hours later, Caleb Whitaker called an emergency meeting. Why wasn't this flagged earlier? He demanded. Ethan flipped through a stack of printed emails. They're overreacting, he said. It's just a temporary supply adjustment. Melissa Grant from HR glanced at the message thread. It doesn't read that way. She replied carefully. The email from Morrison's procurement manager contained only 2 short sentences. We appreciate the previous relationship with Silverline. However, recent communication has raised concerns about operational continuity in the logistics industry. Those words had a very clear translation. They were preparing to move the contract. 2 weeks later, Trident Manufacturing reduced its projected shipment volume by nearly 40% during its renewal discussion. Then Frontier Equipment Supply began redirecting several emergency shipments to another distributor. Inside Silverline, the pattern slowly became impossible to ignore. Caleb began calling Ethan into his office almost every morning. What exactly are you telling these clients? He asked during one meeting. The same thing Nicole used to tell them. Ethan insisted that our systems can support their operations. Caleb rubbed his temples. Then why are they leaving? Ethan didn't have an answer. But the clients did, because nearly every conversation Ethan had with them ended the same way. First a pause, then the same quiet question. Is Nicole Morgan still with your company? And when the answer was no, the tone of the conversation changed. By the end of the quarter, several major contracts were approaching renewal. without the relationships that originally secured them. Those negotiations suddenly became far less certain, and Silverline was about to learn how expensive that difference could be. Within 4 months, the numbers told a story no one inside Silverline Distribution Group could ignore. Contracts across the Midwest division had been lost, reduced, or redirected. Altogether, the total value exceeded $500 million. Investors noticed. And when investors notice something like that, the board does too. The investigation started quietly. Board members rarely announce these things immediately. Instead, they begin with numbers revenue reports, contract renewals, client retention data, over several weeks. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Silverline hadn't lost those contracts because of market conditions. It had lost them because something inside the company had changed. Eventually, Caleb Whitaker was called into a closed-door board meeting. 3 directors sat across from him. Melissa Grant from HR attended as a witness. One of the directors slid a printed report across the table. "Let's begin with the promotion decision," he said. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Another director continued. "The regional operations director position was originally recommended for Nicole Morgan." Caleb nodded slowly. "That was part of the early discussion, and yet the role was given to your stepson." Silence settled over the room. The chairman leaned forward slightly. "We reviewed the internal meeting notes," he said, "including the moment your wife entered the meeting and announced the decision." Caleb's shoulders stiffened. "Your wife," the chairman continued, "does not hold any official executive role inside this company. No one defended the decision. There wasn't much to defend." Another director spoke quietly. "Ethan Whitaker had no prior leadership experience. And within 4 months," he added, tapping the report, "the division lost over $500 million in contracts." The chairman folded his hands. "Silverline did not lose these accounts because of competition." He paused. "We lost them because we removed the person who built them." No one in the room argued with the conclusion, because the numbers had already done that. 2 months later, the board released an internal announcement. Caleb Whitaker would step down as CEO. Shortly afterward, Ethan Whitaker resigned from the company. My first morning at Vanguard Freight Systems began quietly. No announcements, no speeches, just a new office. A whiteboard covered in supply chain maps, and a team waiting to understand how our Midwest operations would grow. "Good to finally have you here," Adrian Cole said, setting a stack of reports on my desk. "We've heard a lot about you." I scanned the documents. Some of the client names were familiar. Not because I had brought them, because they had called. One procurement manager explained it clearly during a phone conversation. "We trust how you run things," he said simply. That was the entire reason. Months later, Adrian walked into my office holding a financial report. "You might find this interesting," he said. The headline was short. Silverline's Midwest division had lost over $500 million in annual contracts. Adrian leaned against the doorframe. "Funny thing," he added. "Caleb Whitaker called last week." I looked up. "He asked if you'd ever consider consulting for them." I smiled slightly. "The person who built their relationships," Adrian said, "already works here and in industries like ours. That's what matters most. Contracts belong to companies, but trust always follows the people who earn it. What stayed with me the most from everything that happened wasn't the promotion I didn't get. It was the realization that respect, trust, and credibility are built slowly, one decision at a time. Titles can be handed out in a meeting, but the relationships behind real work take years to earn. Walking away wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing the value of the work I had done and refusing to bargain with it. Now I'm curious about something. If you were in my position, would you have stayed and fought for the title or walked away and protected your dignity? And by the way, where are you listening from today? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If this story made you think a little differently about work, loyalty, or self-respect, consider subscribing to the channel. Your subscription, your like, or even sharing this video might help someone else see their situation more clearly. Sometimes one story reaching the right person at the right moment can change more than we expect. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.